My name is Michelle Massey. Welcome to today's webinar, once again titled Employing WRIS2, Sharing Wage Records Across States to Track Program Outcomes. For those of you who are not familiar with Workforce Data Quality Campaign, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. Our mission is to advocate for an inclusive, aligned, and market-relevant education and workforce data system that can help our nation's human capital policies meet the challenges of a changing economy. We work at both the federal and state levels to promote reforms for data systems that provide useful information for policymakers, students, and workers, business leaders, and educators. At the state level, we promote a state blueprint that identifies 13 key features of a high-quality data infrastructure. One of our state blueprint items is assessing employment outcomes, which includes cross-state data sharing of employment data to report short and long-term employment outcomes across the range of education, training, and workforce development programs. And that happens to be our discussion topic for today. At the federal level, we address legislation, funding, and technical assistance. Our policy agenda, developed by a broad coalition of national organizations, state leaders, and technical experts across the education and workforce spectrum. Next slide. Our partners have been instrumental in developing this policy agenda, so we want to take a quick moment to recognize them. They are, in alphabetical order, the Association for Career and Technical Education, Association of Public Data Users, Center for Law and Social Policy, Council for Community and Economic Research, Data Quality Campaign, Institute for Higher Education Policy, National Association of State Directors of Career and Technical Education, National Association of State Workforce Agencies, National Skills Coalition, New America Foundation, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Next slide. And we would also like to thank our funders who support our work, the Apollo Group, Lumina Foundation, and Joyce Foundation. Today you will hear from the following panelists: Rachel Zinn of the Workforce Data Quality Campaign, Glen of the Oregon Employment Department, and Ruben Garcia of the Texas Workforce Commission. At this time, I'm going to hand over the presentation to Rachel, who will tell us more about the topic we're going to discuss today. Rachel?
Thank you very much, Michelle. Really appreciate the introduction. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today just about the basics of the WRIS system and how it works, and some of the limitations and the possibilities of the system. So first, the challenge, right? We need to measure employment outcomes across a range of different programs. Policymakers are keenly interested in this to make sure that the programs they're investing in are really preparing people for jobs and career success. A lot of states, in order to measure employment outcomes from their programs, have agreements to share data, and they tap into the unemployment insurance wage records held by their state. So what are unemployment insurance wage records? Employers have to submit wage records for each employee on a quarterly basis to a state agency in order to determine the amount of unemployment benefits that an individual is entitled to if he or she were to lose his job. So UI wage records are maintained in secure databases. They maintain personal confidentiality, and they're often overseen by the state workforce agency. So a lot of these within-state agreements are very effective for helping to accurately measure the outcomes of folks in workforce and education programs. However, they're not sufficient. Workers are mobile. There are actually 5 million workers who live in a different state from where they work. And in addition, when you're trying to measure outcomes over a longer period of time, people move around. Just last year, 4.5 million households moved across state lines. So we need to figure out how to be able to share these wage records across state borders. So thinking about a solution, we have the Wage Record Interchange System, WRIS. And WRIS was established through the Workforce Investment Act in 1998. The act directs the Department of Labor to establish a system that would allow states to share wage records in order to measure the performance of WIA programs. so that the system is operated by DOL. It's operated through a cooperative agreement with the state of Maryland, and it allows states to exchange wage data to report on performance. It works both for the programs funded by WIA and also for training providers who are eligible to provide training under WIA. So the important thing to know about WRIS is it's not a national database. It's in fact just a system that is set up to allow states to share records that are needed specifically for that performance reporting. And WRIS is used specifically for DOL-funded programs. So it's these WIA Title I programs. Okay? So how does WRIS work? There's a several-step process I'm just going to go through. So we have step one is this yellow box, right? So we start with a state agency. And say you have a state workforce agency that wants to get out-of-state wage records for people who may have moved outside the state but finished up, who recently exited a WIA Title I program. So they submit Social Security numbers for people they want to find from other states to the WRIS clearinghouse. And the WRIS clearinghouse, again, it's not a database, but it's a set of automated processes that batches together the Social Security numbers and uses a nationwide index to figure out which state owns those wage records for those particular individuals that belong to those Social Security numbers. And then the clearinghouse ends up sending a query to the correct states to let them know, okay, there's another state out there that is looking for the wage records for these individuals. Our index shows that you have them. And so then each state who receives the query is responsible for batching up the individual wage records and sending them back through the clearinghouse, which puts them together and sends them back to the original requesting state. So as you can see, it's not a seamless process, and it does require cooperation by all of the participating states. But it certainly does facilitate the process and is easier than if each state tried to go to other states individually, because they can just submit one query and get everything back at one time. So in addition to WRIS, there is a system called WRIS2. And WRIS2, very similar operationally to WRIS. It works the same way, although it does have a separate clearinghouse in order and a separate data sharing agreement, which allows for a broader array of programs to receive aggregated reports on UI wage records from all the states for performance reporting. So as opposed to WRIS, the original, which just allowed DOL-funded program performance reporting, this allows a whole list of other programs that are enumerated in the data sharing agreement. So some of these are secondary and post-secondary education programs, adult basic education, Perkins career and technical education, TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, the SNAP employment and training program, vocational rehabilitation, all of these kind of other partner workforce development and education programs that are part of the system of human capital development. So 34 states have committed to participating in WRIS2, of which 28 are ready to send and respond to queries. Other states are kind of in the works to sign on. A handful of other states are just about at the stage to sign on. But there's a couple big states like California and New York, obviously a lot of employees there, and those are missing from the network. So this works best when all the states participate, because then you're getting really you're capturing the full range of employees across the nation. In addition to some states not being signed on to the agreement, we have gotten indications that states are not widely and regularly using WRIS2, either submitting or responding to queries. Again, as you saw in our graphic, it does take effort by each of the state agencies to respond to these queries, and we don't think that they're all doing that on a regular basis. And I know that our panelists are going to talk about what it takes for a state to do that and some of the reasons why that may not be happening. So in addition to just the functional limitations of states perhaps not using the system, there are some limitations built into the data sharing agreement. So some of these restrictions, WRIS2 can only be used for required performance reporting, and that means performance reporting that's actually required by federal or state law or regulation. So for example, the federal government doesn't currently require reporting on employment outcomes for bachelor degree programs. So if a higher education consortium in a state wanted to use WRIS2 to track those employment outcomes, it would need to have state laws or regulations in place to do it. They couldn't do it just because they wanted to. They need to have some mandate to do so. Second, there are limits on research and evaluation as distinct from performance reporting. So wage data obtained through either WRIS or WRIS2 can't be used for research and evaluation without the specific consent of each state that is contributing data. In addition, research has to be related to the programs specified in the WRIS and WRIS2 agreements. In addition, in addition, data has to be destroyed. The data sharing agreements say that the data can only be kept for the period of time required to utilize it for assessment and reporting purposes or to satisfy federal records retention requirements. So this makes it difficult for states to do kind of long-term longitudinal analysis, such as if they wanted to examine earnings trajectories over many years. Also, WRIS2 has the limitations of the underlying UI wage record data, which is that UI wage records only cover people in covered occupations, so it doesn't include people who are self-employed or people who work for the military or federal government. States can fill the gaps in the data on military and federal personnel by using actually another data exchange system called Impetus, which is the Federal Employment Data Exchange System. And that's also funded by DOL and operated by the state of Maryland. And Impetus provides access to federal and military wage records, and there's 44 states participating in that effort. So that can help fill in the gaps, although you'd still be missing the self-employed and some other uncovered occupations, such as farmers are one that are often missing. So we have a system that has a lot of potential. It's working okay, as you'll hear from our state panelists, and it is doing some good things. But we think that as the WDQC, and to further our vision of really being able to accurately and completely report employment outcomes across our range of education and training, we think we can do a little better. So we have some policy recommendations for the federal government. Interagency guidance, we think that some key agencies, the U.S. Department of Labor, Department of Education, Health and Human Services, could issue some guidance to encourage states to be using the system, to be sharing wage records, and we think that there can be some clarification as well and education coming out of these agencies on what WRIS2 can be used for. DOL has gone out and done some education on this, but in our conversations with states, there's still a lot of confusion about how this can be used, and we think especially having other agencies promote to their constituents for programs like Perkins, TANF, and SNAP E&T that this can be helpful for them would make a big difference. Incentives for participation. In its latest rounds of the Workforce Data Quality Initiative grants to support state data systems, DOL has actually required participation in WRIS2. And we applaud that effort. We encourage the federal government to keep looking for those kind of incentives to encourage use of the system. Assisting with research and evaluation, DOL has expressed interest in facilitating agreements between states that would allow their data to be used for specific research projects. We think that's fantastic and encourage them to do so. And we'd also encourage Department of Labor to think about amending the data sharing agreement, thinking about if it could allow more flexibility for research and evaluation, or perhaps developing even a WRIS3 for states that are willing to push the envelope and exchange UI wage records for a broader range of purposes. And finally, WDQC does have suggestions for legislative revisions. We think that there could be a legislative mandate that states participate in data sharing agreements like WRIS and WRIS2 to obtain out-of-state wage records. That could be a condition of funding. And finally, just want to mention that this is an issue that Workforce Data Quality Campaign is going to continue to keep an eye on, and we also pledge to help move this issue forward. We're going to continue talking to states and working with them to document and disseminate how they have effectively used WRIS2 and provide opportunities like this webinar for state leaders to talk about how cross-state data sharing is beneficial. We're looking at doing some outreach to states that are not as involved in these data sharing agreements and trying to help them understand the benefits and also recognize those that are newly aboard and are pushing this forward. Finally, advocating for resources. We understand that effectively operating systems like this requires resources at both the federal and state levels. This is something we can advocate for. We think this is important and deserves resource support. So thank you very much. If we don't get to any of your questions during the Q&A, happy to have you contact us directly. And now we'll turn it over to John to hear about how Oregon is using WRIS2.
Thank you. I'd like to begin my presentation with the history of WRIS2. The history is the foundation of my presentation, which will help provide the context to why WRIS2 was developed and the reason behind the limitations that I'll cover later in my presentation. In the early days of WRIS, a few states signed the data sharing agreement and started sharing wage data between the states. States were successfully using WRIS data for WIA reporting. Data transfers were secure, and the states using WRIS soon discovered that WRIS data increased their performance reporting. Word spread that WRIS was successful, and the states who chose not to participate initially soon signed on and to become members of WRIS. Now all 50 states and the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico are members of WRIS. Education partners in Oregon heard about WRIS. These education partners approached the Oregon Employment Department and asked if they could have access to the WRIS data for their state and federal performance reporting. The education partners in Oregon were informed that WRIS had specific limitations on the use of the data. The data could only be used for state and federal performance reporting for programs under DOL. Therefore, we had to inform our education partners that we were unable to share the WRIS data with them, but being good partners that we are, we agreed to approach the WRIS Advisory Committee to seek an amendment to the WRIS data sharing agreement. The WRIS Advisory Committee is an advisory committee that provides guidance to WRIS and WRIS2. And these are members of each of the states that are involved in WRIS. During a 2008 WRIS Advisory Committee, Oregon and Washington presented a proposed amendment to the WRIS data sharing agreement. The purpose of the proposed amendment was to extend the use of WRIS data to education partners. Next slide, please. So after much discussion, most states indicated they agreed with the amendment. However, a few states indicated that they could not support the amendment because their state statutes prohibited the sharing of confidential data, confidential wage records with education entities. As a result of the discussion, a work group was formed from representatives from Missouri, Oregon, Texas, and Utah. The purpose of the work group was to identify and propose alternative strategies where data could be shared with education and other workforce programs. During 2009, the work group developed and distributed 2 electronic surveys to states with the purpose of determining how, if at all, wage data could be shared with the education and other workforce training providers. The findings from the survey indicated, 1, that there appeared to be a clear preference among states that were interested in expanding the sharing of wage data, that this be conducted through the existing PACIAs, which is the Performance Accountability and Customer Information Agency. That's the agency that received the wage data from the other agencies. And 2, a few states suggested that the PACIA would be most likely to bear largest burden for executing the data sharing agreement on behalf of additional program performance entities. Also, while a few states have laws prohibiting their participation, they would consider participating if the confidential wage record remained with the PACIA. After much discussion, the work group proposed to the WRIS Advisory Committee the development of a new additional system for the purpose of sharing wage data with education and workforce training programs. The system would be called WRIS2. WRIS2 would mirror WRIS, but would extend the use of the wage data to education and workforce training programs. There was one major limitation to the new system, which is what's called WRIS2, and that was confidential wage data had to remain with the existing PACIA. WRIS2 was a mirror of WRIS in several ways. The same security measures developed for WRIS would be applied to WRIS2. The process for requesting wage data is the same between the two systems. Like WRIS, the confidential wage data must remain with the current PACIA. Both systems have data sharing agreements, which must be signed by both PACIAs and the SWIA, which SWIA is the State Unemployment Insurance Agency. That's the body that holds the entity that holds the wage records. In both systems, state participation is voluntary. A concern of a few states from the surveys included the additional burden placed upon the SWIA to respond to requests. To help relieve some of that burden, the Distributed Database Index, which we call DDBI, submitted to the WRIS by the SWIA would be duplicated for WRIS2. This would leave the SWIA having to prepare and submit the DDBI twice during each quarter. Next slide, please. WRIS and WRIS2 have similarities, as I mentioned, but also include differences between the two systems. WRIS is to be used only for performance reporting for DOL-funded programs, and WRIS2 wage data can be obtained to prepare aggregated statistical reports and analysis to satisfy the reporting and performance requirements under federal or state legislation or federal or state regulation by what we call third-party entities. We call them TPEs. A TPE are any public body, agency, or private career school. Also, there are separate platforms to submit the receive wage data from the hub, and WRIS has 52 members, whereas WRIS2 currently has 35. Next slide, please. So how does a state become a member of WRIS2? First, the state must be a member of WRIS, and the current PACIA and SWIA must both sign the WRIS2 data sharing agreement. WRIS2 data sharing agreement is located on the DOL ETA website under the WRIS2 website if you're interested in looking at that. Next slide, please. After state signs the WRIS2 data sharing agreement, Xerox opens an account, gives you access to the WRIS2 platform. Like WRIS, WRIS2 requires all individuals with access to the WRIS2 data to sign an acknowledgement form indicating they've read and understood the confidentiality and restrictions on the use of the data. The WRIS2 data sharing agreement includes the requirement that PACIA develops a separate agreement with the TPE. The agreement should include the confidential guidelines of the state and the terms and conditions consistent with the WRIS2 data sharing agreement. The SWIA also responds to the data request, and the final step is for the PACIA to develop aggregated reports for the TPE as outlined in the agreement. Aggregated data is where a cell contains at least 3 records. Your state may have stricter guidelines to share the aggregated data. I put resources on the bottom in bold because by now you've probably concluded that staff resources allocated to produce the aggregated reports for the TPE is necessary. How much resources is dependent upon the number of TPE agreements you have and the types and frequency of the reports. Next slide, please. So how do we in Oregon use WRIS2 data? Since the Oregon Employment Department is the State Unemployment Insurance Agency, the SWIA, we are responsible for state legislative mandated workforce performance system. The system has been in existence since the early 1990s and was upgraded during 2001. The system is called PRISM, which stands for Performance Reporting Information System. 6 programs submit customer data to the system, and 4 of the 6 programs fall under the umbrella of workforce training providers, and all are public entities, and we have agreements with each. Therefore, we utilize WRIS2 data to supplement performance reporting for the 4 entities. We also use WRIS2 data for the TAC grants. A community college recipient of a DOL grant approached us and asked if we would be willing to produce the aggregate reports for them. We agreed, and we developed an agreement between our agency and the community college to produce the aggregated reports. We utilize WRIS2 data to supplement the performance reporting for that. Next slide, please. Here's an example of one of our performance reports we produce for our state workforce performance system, PRISM. The WRIS2 data is used to supplement the community college post-secondary and technical education, Title II basic education, and TANF jobs, and vocational rehabilitation, which you see are the agencies on the bottom of the report on the left there. Next slide, please. This is an example of the report we produced for the community college TAC grant. As you can see from this example, cells with less than 3 records are suppressed by the asterisk. Next slide, please. How much does WRIS2 data increase the performance reporting? The reports for the TAC grant performance increased as much as 9 percentage points. In Oregon, we have a town with a community college that is basically on the border of Idaho, and many of these students live in Idaho, attend the community college in Oregon, and work in Idaho. Idaho is a WRIS2 member, which helps increase the employment outcome performance drastically for those reports. In PRISM, we use WRIS2 data, and that has increased the percent employed by about 1 percentage point. Next slide, please. The match rates for the TAC grant is 11%, and for PRISM, the range is 5 to 6% on our matching to WRIS2 wage data. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges facing states participating or thinking about participating in WRIS2? Since WRIS2 has a limitation of sharing aggregate data only, resources, of course, have to be allocated to produce the reports. This limitation may possibly affect the decision by some states to choose not to participate in WRIS2. If resources are not there to produce the aggregate report, there's probably not much incentive to participate. However, I do know of one state that is a WRIS2 member, and they are not planning on submitting records for matching, but they choose to participate only to respond to requests. And their motive is that their state is adjacent to several other states which are all WRIS2 members, so they're being a good partner. As with WRIS, WRIS2 data matches include 8 quarters of data. And finally, the use of WRIS2 data is limited to the reporting required by federal or state legislation. And next slide, please. This is my contact information, and feel free to contact me. And the Oregon Performance Reporting System, PRISM, the website, there's a link to it on there, but it's www.oregon.gov/PRISM. That concludes my presentation.
Great, and we'll turn it over to our final presenter, Ruben Garcia.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Ruben Garcia. I'm with the Texas Workforce Commission. Next slide, please. The impetus for Texas joining WRIS2 was to have a mechanism to satisfy the reporting and performance requirements for certain federal or state training and education programs. Among them are Perkins, and we have state legislation, Senate Bill 281, which created our automated follow-up system. And finally, our Texas State Technical College system requested a new funding formula for their technical programs based partially on the labor market outcomes of their graduates. So, next slide. So we did a pilot study using WDQI-1 grant funds, and we piloted a link to the WRIS2 system for the Texas State Technical College system. There are 4 campuses, one at Waco, one at Marshall, one at Harlingen, and one in West Texas. As I mentioned previously, the system, which is a publicly funded institution, requested our legislature to start a new funding formula partly tied to the post-exit labor market outcomes of their graduates. So it was really important for us to look at many different kinds of resources to document labor market outcomes for your graduates. So in addition to the UI wage records, WRIS2 presented an opportunity to link these student records. Next slide. Now, we wouldn't have been able to achieve that data sharing without the guidance of the U.S. Department of Education and the Private Technical Assistance Center, which basically helped us formulate a data sharing agreement with the correct legalese terms so that the legal counsels of the Texas State Technical College system and the Texas Workforce Commission could agree to allow the exchange of student data within the FERPA guidelines. Next slide. Once the data sharing agreement was signed between Texas Workforce Commission and the TSTC system, TSTC provided us with graduate cohorts from 4 years, 2008 all the way to 2011, for a total number of records of 7,557. These are students who graduated from technical programs at the Texas State Technical College system. Each student record contained a social security number, the school ID, the major by 6-digit code, and award level, gender, ethnicity. And these data were shared through a secure file transfer process using a software called Tumbleweed. Once we received the data, we linked them, we sent those records to WRIS2, and we asked those records to be linked to the 4th quarter of 2012 UI wage records to determine labor market outcomes for those graduates. Next slide. The next series of slides are some tables that we generated out of the results of the linkages. In our state, we were all cell sizes that have values less than 3 are marked with an NA to protect the privacy of cohort members. Of the 7,557 students that we linked to WRIS2, we found 134 of them. That's a little over 1.5% of the cohort. The largest numbers we found in the state of Oklahoma and Louisiana, understandably, they are the closest to us, to the state of Texas. Next slide. The next slide, we looked at the graduates' majors where we found the most through WRIS2. So these are the top 5 majors that we found through WRIS2. Graduates in electromechanical and instrumentation maintenance technologies, metalworking, vehicle maintenance, electrical engineering technologies, and computer information technologies rounded up the top 5. Next slide. This slide is showing you the graduates working out of state by year of graduation. We didn't find as many people who graduated from 2008. However, we found quite a bit for graduates from 2010 and 2011. Next slide. This slide is showing you graduates working out of state by gender. The majority of graduates from our technical college system were males who ended up working outside of the boundaries of the state of Texas. Next slide. This slide is showing you our graduates from PSTC working out of state by award level. And it looks like our graduates who had associate degrees were more prone to going out of state compared to those that were who only received certificates. Next slide. Now, here are the benefits for using WRIS2 for us in the state of Texas. The data provided us with information on where our graduates are finding jobs after graduation who are not found in our state. And where available, the data can be used to supplement employment rates by programs to meet performance standards. Much like Oregon had mentioned in a prior presentation, at the moment we haven't really done much with our data to get to that point yet. We've only been able to produce those basic tables that I showed you in my previous slides. Next slide. Future applications. The Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board has a supplemental report which we call CB116, which is a list of SSNs of former graduates from technical programs who were not located in Texas using our UI wage records. One application of WRIS2 is that if the data can be shared at the student level, can then be linked back to the CB116 and actually use the supplemental data to compute a more accurate employment rate for each institution and program that is being reported for Perkins or for state reporting. Next slide. Also, future applications, it would be nice to link statewide cohorts of post-secondary education technical program graduates to WRIS2. At the moment, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, which collects all post-secondary education records in Texas, is still reviewing their FERPA policy, and a decision has not been made to share data with TWC. However, for WRIS2 to be of optimal use, it must be allowed to be shared at the unit record level. Next slide. And here's my contact information. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Ruben. At this time, we're going to open it up for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we will open your lines one at a time, or you can type a question into the question box. While we're waiting for hands, we do have a two-part question that was typed by Elise Schanbacker. I'm going to read that question. Do the federal performance reporting requirements also apply to Impetus? And if so, how stringent is that requirement? Would any of our panelists, possibly Rachel, want to take that?
Sure. So I will confess that I'm not as familiar with the Impetus requirements. My understanding is that yes, the Impetus has to be used, like the WRIS systems, for reporting. It can only be used for reporting on mandated performance reporting, either at the state or federal level. I don't know, John or Ruben, do your states use Impetus?
This is Ruben. Yes, we do. For the higher education programs, I think it's limited to records of students who are required to be reported in a federal report, such as Perkins. So you can't just send all of your records. It has to be used to address the needs of federal reporting only. That's my understanding.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It looks like we have a couple of hands raised. So it looks like Erica Franco. Erica, I'm going to open your line so that you can ask your question. It looks like your line is open.
Hi. Actually, it's not Erica. Erica's my secretary who scheduled this. This is Spencer Wong. I'm the LMI chief in California. A couple questions occur to me, and we've had conversations with I believe, the Maryland vendor before. Yeah, and we were still unclear on exactly the process on this. So I've got a couple of questions, actually. First of all, okay, it appears that the record-holding state does the data match, okay? Once the data are matched, who actually does the data aggregation, and what does the requesting state receive back?
Sure. So, John, you want to address this since I know you actually use the system?
The Performance Accountability Agency, the PACIA, submits the SSNs to be matched to a hub, which Xerox is the contractor for. And they take those SSNs, and I mentioned a DDBI file, which is SWIA submits each quarter, and that DDBI file is basically all the SSNs for 8 quarters that are in their wage file. So Xerox takes that file that is submitted by the PACIA, and they match it. They know which states have the wage records, and they send those that request out to the state unemployment insurance agency, the SWIA. The SWIA then does the match and then sends that data back to Xerox, the hub, and Xerox puts all the records together and then sends it back to the PACIA, which submitted the request. And so it's one file, and it could be hundreds or thousands of records in there for all the states. And it usually, they guarantee a 14-day turnaround. Sometimes if you're only requesting for a couple of states, it can be quicker than that.
Okay, so so actually the micro records are actually being returned to the requesting state, not aggregated data?
That is correct.
Okay, then my next question is, especially in California, there are very specific instances or situations or, well, anyway, there are very specific regulations on who can get data for what and for what purposes someone can access our confidential data. Now, would those rules be applied when releasing data back to? Well, actually, I'm thinking about it. I don't think under any circumstances do other states have authority to access our confidential data records. So, in this circumstance,
if you're members of WRIS2, which have to sign a separate data sharing agreement, and there's a separate portal, so if you're a member of WRIS but not WRIS2, there's no chance for another state who is a WRIS2 member to get access to your records.
No, my point is, if we participate in WRIS2, though, it would actually, at least in California, probably require legislation for us to join WRIS2.
Yes.
Because we have specific rules on who can access data and the purposes under which those entities can receive the data or access the data.
Yes, and that if your state legislation limits who you can give data to and in what kind, then yes, you'd have to you have to change the legislation.
Okay. That actually clarifies quite a bit for us out here, I think.
All right. Thank you very much for your question. We appreciate that. At this time, it looks like we have James Parker who has a question to ask. James, your line is open.
Yes, thank you. I have 2 questions around adult basic education and English as second language. The first question is for our Oregon presenter. How well is that being used by the Adult Education Program Office? And is it active in your PRISM system?
Yeah, they in our state workforce performance reporting system, they submit records quarterly, and the records they submit are customer information data. What kind of services did they get, and the demographic information is included. And we take that data, and we have a database that does all the programming for the measures. We have 4 different measures, and each quarter when we submit those SSNs for the Title II Adult Basic Education, we send those up to the hub to do the matching, send us back the SSN, the wage data, and we take that and put that in a separate table. We do not put it into the database, and then we use those records along with Oregon records to produce the measures. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it sounds like it's very active and useful.
Yes.
Second question is with the pending legislation, however it's pronounced, perhaps WIO or WIO, that's going to require a lot more data and different kinds of data for adult education programs. Would either the 3 of you like to comment on that?
So this is Rachel. Yeah, I think that if that legislation does pass, that WRIS2 and other sorts of data sharing agreements are going to become increasingly important. For the reason you mentioned, there's a lot more mandated reporting, and in addition, what that bill would do is it actually, so right now for WIA Title I programs, there is a direction that employment outcomes use wage records for reporting, as opposed to surveys or some other methodology, and now that section is put into the accountability section, which applies across all the programs in the bill. So this would suggest that adult education also should be using wage records for its reporting purposes. So this seems like a definite push for WRIS2 to be useful for states and for states to become more active. The other kind of opportunity we see in addition to adult basic education is the recently passed Farm Bill establishes a lot of reporting requirements for the SNAP employment and training programs. So WRIS2 may become really key to those systems as they gear up and think about performance reporting.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Parker, for your call. It looks like we have another question from Kim Heacock. Kim, your line is open.
Hi, actually this is Pamela Geithner and from California also, and I was going to follow up on Spencer's question. If we sign up for WRIS2 and we become a member state, do we have the ability to block just the requests or not respond to the requests that might not meet our need and use in California, or the provisions for us to release data? Or would we have to sign up for all requests coming through the consortium?
The requests, you have to sign up for all. It's when you sign the WRIS2 data sharing agreement, it means you're all in and not just partly in.
So we don't have the ability to block requests or not respond to requests that don't meet our data exchange or sharing provisions?
I guess I don't understand the question. So
John, for example, when a requesting state sees the state, when the requests come in, they don't know who in the requesting state, like which agency wants it, right? I mean, they're just seeing basically a few. Right, you're just seeing a few data points, so I think it would be hard to discern which requests are meeting state requirements if it filters out specific agencies.
Okay. And of the states that are in the consortium now or who have joined WRIS2, do you know how many of those needed conforming legislation to allow the exchange?
I don't know that. This is John, and I don't know.
Okay. But there were states that needed specific legislation to join?
This is Ruben from Texas. No, we did not need state legislation to join.
And here in Oregon, we didn't either.
And I am not sure if there were others who did need specific legislative change. That's definitely something we can follow up on and get back to you.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you. It looks like we have a couple questions that came in via the question box. I'm going to read those. Does the limitation on the use of WRIS2 data only for state or federal required reports also apply to research? And that question came in from Mary Galligan.
And the answer to that, this is John, is yes. Under the data sharing agreement, it's even for research, it would be required for state or federal reporting.
Okay, thank you. And Rachel, it looks like we have a question for you. Are you aware of any states that voluntarily or on a fee basis share aggregate data with nonprofit employment, social enterprises, or workforce development organizations? And this question came from Janet Van Lapierre.
So the one I'm aware of is New York State has recently passed some legislation and is in the process of implementing it that gives a broader range of entities access to their UI wage records. They specifically mentioned in the legislation is the City University of New York system, so they can actually access some individual data for research. But my understanding is that the implementation of that law is going to allow aggregate reports to go to additional entities, including nonprofits and workforce development. And again, that's only within their state data. That kind of arrangement for cross-state data sharing I have not heard of. Although WRIS2 does allow it for third-party entities, so it would allow that kind of reporting. My understanding is that through WRIS2, actually there have not been any third-party entities that have taken advantage of the reporting, but perhaps that is changing.
All right, thank you for that. And it looks like we have a question for Ruben. The Texas system record of 7,557, does that exclude students without a Social Security number? And that question came from Ellen Boswell.
The answer is yes.
All right, thank you very much. It looks like we don't have any other questions at this time. If anyone wants to get in a last-minute question, we're still open to that. But if not, we did receive a couple questions now about the clarification on the acronyms that John used. So TPE and SWIA and PACIA, if you could just go through what those meant again, I think several of our audience members would be happy.
Certainly. The TPE is the third-party entity. That would be the entity, the public entity or private career school that would approach the Customer Information Agency, which is the PACIA, Performance Accountability Customer Information Agency. The SWIA is the State Unemployment Insurance Agency, and that's the agency which holds the UI wage records. And in many cases, the PACIA and SWIA are the same. Here in Oregon, it's the same agency.
Great.
So those often, right. So sorry, Michelle, 1 second. So those, just to clarify, so those, both of those acronyms often end up pointing to the state workforce agency, which is kind of the gatekeeper in the WRIS2 universe.
Yes.
All right, and it looks like with that, that is the final question. So at this time, I will hand the presentation back to Rachel to close out.
I just want to say thank you so much to John and Ruben for taking the time to talk to us about their state's experiences using RIS2. It's really helpful to get kind of a hands-on perspective on how the system has been used and how it's been beneficial. And I just want to thank all our audience members for joining us as well. We're happy to follow up with you and answer any questions. Our contact information is on the screen now, and we will be sending out a link to accessing the presentation, and our information will be available through that as well. So please feel free to follow up with us if you have questions at a later time. Thank you all.
Thank you.